Sometimes cruelty reveals itself in the smallest moments, especially when the wrong person is watching. The emergency room at St. Matthew's Medical Center glowed under rows of fluorescent lights that never seemed to dim, not at midnight, not at 3 in the morning, not even when the outside world slowed down. Inside the ER, time moved differently. Monitors chirped in steady rhythms, rolling carts rattled across polished floors, and the smell of antiseptic hung faintly in the air. Nurses moved quickly between curtained bays while doctors called out instructions in calm but urgent voices. In the center of that carefully controlled chaos stood Hannah Brooks, a 25-year-old nurse whose quiet presence most people barely noticed. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and she carried a stainless steel tray of surgical tools with both hands, careful not to let the instruments shift as she navigated the narrow space between equipment and staff. Hannah had only been working the ER night shift for a few months, but she had already learned that survival here depended on staying calm and staying invisible. Unfortunately, invisibility doesn't always protect you from attention. As Hannah stepped past the trauma bay entrance, someone brushed past her shoulder in the rush of movement. The tray tilted slightly. One metal clamp slid forward, tapped the edge of the tray, and dropped onto the tile floor with a sharp metallic clatter that seemed louder than the alarms and voices surrounding it. For a brief moment the room slowed. Several heads turned. A young resident paused mid-sentence. And then the unmistakable voice of Chief Surgeon Andrew Keller cut through the background noise like a blade through silk. Dr. Keller was the kind of man whose reputation entered a room before he did. To patients he was a miracle worker. To the hospital board he was a star. But to the staff who worked beneath him every night, he was something far more complicated. He stepped toward Hannah now, tall, confident, his expression tightening as he looked down at the fallen instrument. Hannah bent immediately to retrieve it, whispering a quiet apology before anyone even asked for one. But Dr. Keller reached forward and caught the back of her tied hair with a quick tug, not enough to hurt, but enough to stop her movement and pull her attention upward. The motion froze the space around them. Conversation stopped. A nurse sat. The medication cart suddenly became very interested in reading a label. No one said a word. "How many times?" Dr. Keller said sharply, his voice low but unmistakably irritated. "Do I have to remind you to stay focused in my ER?" Hannah's cheeks warmed, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, murmuring another apology as she picked up the instrument and placed it carefully back on the tray. Within seconds the emergency room returned to motion as if nothing unusual had happened. Monitors continued their steady beeping. A gurney rolled past toward radiology. Orders were called out, and charts were updated. Yet beyond the glass partition of the waiting area, one man had not looked away for even a moment. He sat quietly in a chair near the wall, his dark jacket folded neatly around broad shoulders, his posture relaxed but alert. To most people passing through the waiting room, he looked like just another visitor waiting for news. But his eyes were steady, thoughtful, and far more observant than anyone realized. When Hannah Brooks straightened and quietly resumed her work, the man leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees as he studied the scene unfolding inside the ER. His name was Vincent DeLuca, though almost no one in the hospital knew that yet. And in that quiet moment, as the emergency room rushed onward without noticing him, Vincent began to watch Hannah Brooks very carefully. The emergency room returned to its rhythm as if the moment had been swallowed by the constant motion of the night shift, but Hannah Brooks did not move as quickly as before. She steadied the tray against the stainless steel counter and carefully aligned the instruments again, making sure every clamp and retractor rested exactly where it belonged. Her hands were steady now, but inside she could still feel the warmth in her cheeks slowly fading. Around her, the staff continued their work with the quiet efficiency that defined the ER after midnight. A paramedic pushed through the sliding doors with a patient on a gurney. 2 nurses hurried to prepare an examination bay, and the overhead speakers called for respiratory therapy in a calm mechanical voice. In a place where emergencies arrived every few minutes, there was simply no time for anyone to dwell on what had just happened. Yet Hannah did not allow herself to pause either. She finished organizing the tray, lifted it again, and moved toward the next station where a young boy sat on the edge of a hospital bed, swinging his legs nervously. The child could not have been more than 8 years old, his small hands gripping the edge of the blanket while his mother stood nearby with a worried expression. The boy's eyes followed every movement in the room, wide and uncertain, clearly overwhelmed by the bright lights and unfamiliar machines. Hannah lowered the tray onto a nearby counter and crouched slightly so that her eyes were level with his. Her voice softened immediately, as if the tension of the room could not reach her while she spoke to him. She explained gently that the doctor only needed to check his arm, and that the machines making the beeping sounds were simply there to help the nurses keep everyone safe. The boy listened, his shoulders relaxing just enough for him to nod slowly. His mother offered a quiet thank you, relief visible on her face. Hannah smiled politely before returning to her work, adjusting the blanket and making sure the monitoring cable rested comfortably against the boy's sleeve. From across the glass partition in the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca watched the interaction without shifting in his chair. He had seen many hospitals over the years, often in moments when tension and urgency filled every corner of the building. But what caught his attention now was not the chaos of the emergency room. It was the way Hannah Brooks moved through it. Most people, after being publicly corrected by a superior, would either withdraw into silence or rush through their duties with visible frustration. Hannah did neither. She continued her work with the same calm patience she had shown before, speaking softly to patients, adjusting equipment with careful hands, and offering quiet reassurance wherever it was needed. Vincent leaned back slightly, studying the scene through the glass as nurses crossed the hallway and the sliding doors opened again for another incoming case. Something about the young nurse stood out against the background of hurried footsteps and clipped medical instructions. Perhaps it was the fact that she had not allowed embarrassment to harden her expression, or perhaps it was the way the frightened boy had looked at her, as if she were the only calm presence in the room. Either way, Vincent DeLuca found that his attention continued returning to the same person every few seconds. And while the emergency room carried on with its endless cycle of arrivals and departures, he remained seated in the waiting area, watching Hannah Brooks as if the quiet details of her character had suddenly become far more important than the reason he had come to the hospital in the first place. The emergency room continued to pulse with its relentless rhythm as the night stretched deeper into the early hours. The bright fluorescent lights reflected across polished floors while nurses moved between stations with quiet urgency. Hannah Brooks had already completed 3 patient charts, restocked 2 medication carts, and assisted with a minor procedure, all without drawing attention to herself again. In a place like St. Matthew's Medical Center, attention from the wrong person could follow you for the rest of your shift, and Hannah had learned quickly that the safest path was to keep her head down and her work flawless. What most people did not know was that Hannah had spent years learning exactly how to disappear inside busy environments. Growing up in a small apartment in Queens, she had been the older sister who stayed quiet while helping her mother manage endless hospital bills after her father's heart condition forced him to stop working. Nursing school had not been easy, and the tuition alone had nearly broken the family's finances more than once. Hannah had taken extra shifts as a medical assistant, studied late into the night, and graduated near the top of her class without ever drawing attention to herself. She did not chase recognition. She chased stability. And stability meant working hard enough that no one could question her place in the hospital. Unfortunately, the emergency room did not always reward quiet dedication. Dr. Andrew Keller walked through the department again about 15 minutes after the earlier incident, his long white coat moving sharply behind him as he reviewed notes on a tablet. Conversation softened when he passed. Nurses stepped aside slightly to clear his path. It was a reaction that had developed over years of working beneath his authority. Dr. Keller had built a reputation that made administrators proud and staff cautious. He was known throughout the hospital network for performing complex surgeries that other surgeons refused to attempt, and his results were often remarkable. But brilliance came with a cost, and everyone who worked under him knew that cost could appear in the form of sharp criticism delivered without hesitation. Hannah noticed him only briefly as he crossed the room again. She lowered her gaze toward the patient chart she was updating and continued writing, careful not to make any movement that might draw his attention a second time. Nearby, 2 younger nurses exchanged a quick glance before quietly returning to their tasks as well. The atmosphere shifted slightly whenever Dr. Keller entered the room, like a temperature change that no one openly acknowledged but everyone felt. Across the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca continued to observe the subtle changes inside the emergency room. He noticed the way conversations paused when the surgeon approached. He noticed the tension in the shoulders of the younger staff members. And he noticed the way Hannah Brooks instinctively positioned herself behind the medication counter, as if avoiding the center of the room entirely. Vincent had spent most of his life reading rooms filled with powerful personalities, and the dynamic unfolding inside the ER was not difficult to understand. Authority was clear. Fear was quiet, but present. Yet what caught his attention again was how Hannah carried herself within that environment. She did not show resentment. She did not whisper complaints to coworkers. Instead, she continued assisting patients, adjusting equipment, and offering calm reassurance whenever someone looked overwhelmed by the noise and urgency of the department. It was a quiet resilience that did not seek recognition. Vincent leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he continued to watch through the glass partition. In a place filled with noise, authority, and constant motion, the most interesting person in the room was still the quiet nurse who refused to let humiliation change the way she treated the people around her. The steady rhythm of the emergency room continued as another ambulance siren faded somewhere outside the hospital entrance, and within seconds the sliding doors opened again with a burst of cool night air. Paramedics rolled in a new patient while nurses immediately shifted into motion, adjusting equipment, preparing charts, and clearing space around the trauma bay. Hannah Brooks moved with the practiced efficiency she had developed during months of overnight shifts, stepping forward to assist while keeping her voice calm and steady for the anxious family members who hovered nearby. She checked the patient's wristband, verified the intake notes, and gently reassured a worried daughter that the doctors were already preparing everything necessary. In the middle of that controlled urgency, Dr. Andrew Keller returned to the center of the department, his expression focused as he scanned the situation with quick professional judgment. When he gave instructions, people responded immediately. A resident hurried to retrieve lab forms. Another nurse prepared the monitoring equipment. For several minutes, the entire emergency room functioned like a precisely coordinated machine, each person performing their role without hesitation. Hannah handed a pair of sterile gloves to the resident beside her and adjusted the intravenous line for the incoming patient, making sure the tubing rested correctly along the edge of the bed. She had learned to anticipate the needs of others before they spoke them aloud, a habit that made difficult shifts easier for everyone around her. Yet, even careful preparation could not eliminate every small mistake during a busy night. As Hannah reached for a second instrument from the tray beside her, the wheel of a passing supply cart nudged lightly against the corner of the table. The movement was minor, barely noticeable in the rush of activity, but it caused one small tool to slide toward the edge of the tray and tap against the metal surface. The sound was quiet, but Dr. Keller noticed it instantly. His attention turned toward Hannah again, and the air in the immediate area seemed to tighten. Conversations softened. A resident paused halfway through a sentence. Dr. Keller stepped closer, his tone sharp but controlled as he addressed her in front of the surrounding staff. He questioned her focus, reminding her that the emergency room demanded absolute attention at every moment. The words themselves were not shouted, yet the authority behind them made the exchange impossible to ignore. Hannah lowered her eyes respectfully and apologized once more, adjusting the tray and confirming that every instrument remained exactly where it should be. She spoke quietly, her voice calm despite the sudden attention. Around them, several nurses pretended to concentrate on patient monitors while avoiding direct eye contact. It was a familiar pattern inside the department. No one openly challenged the chief surgeon during a shift. The emergency room had long ago learned how to absorb moments like this and move forward. From the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca observed the second exchange with the same steady attention he had maintained since arriving. The glass partition did little to hide the expressions on the faces inside the department. He could see the subtle discomfort in the younger staff members and the careful composure Hannah maintained as she returned to assisting the patient without hesitation. What stood out to him was not the criticism itself, but the contrast between authority and restraint. Dr. Keller commanded the room with reputation and position. Hannah held her place with quiet patience that never shifted into anger or protest. As the medical team resumed their work and the patient was guided toward the examination bay, Vincent remained seated in the waiting area, his gaze following Hannah Brooks once again as she moved back to the medication counter and continued her duties as though the entire moment had simply passed like another routine instruction in the long rhythm of the night shift. The emergency room slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm after the brief tension faded, the steady beeping of monitors blending with the quiet murmur of voices and the rolling wheels of supply carts. Hannah Brooks stood behind the medication counter reviewing a patient chart, carefully verifying the dosage instructions before preparing the next set of supplies. Her movements remained precise and unhurried, the kind of steady routine that helped the long overnight hours pass without drawing unnecessary attention. A young man seated on a nearby gurney shifted nervously while waiting for a physician, and Hannah paused her work long enough to adjust the blanket around his shoulders and reassure him that someone would be with him shortly. It was a small gesture, almost invisible among the many tasks unfolding across the department, yet the patient's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Moments like that happened dozens of times each night in the emergency room, and most of them passed without recognition. But Vincent DeLuca noticed them. From his seat in the waiting area, he had been observing the department for nearly half an hour now, long enough to understand the rhythm of the staff and the personalities moving through the room. His original reason for coming to St. Matthew's Medical Center remained important, yet his attention continued returning to the same quiet nurse who seemed determined to move through the chaos without letting the earlier embarrassment shape her behavior. Vincent had built much of his life on reading people quickly, in business, in negotiations, and in environments where authority and pressure collided. Character often revealed itself in moments others ignored. That was what he was watching now. Hannah Brooks did not seek sympathy from her coworkers, nor did she allow frustration to surface in the way she spoke to patients. Instead, she continued doing exactly what she had been trained to do, moving from one task to the next with calm efficiency. Across the department, Dr. Andrew Keller completed his discussion with a resident and began walking toward the medication counter again. His posture remained confident, his expression focused as he scanned the charts displayed on the tablet in his hand. The younger staff members around him adjusted their movements slightly to give him space as he approached. It was not fear exactly, but it was close enough that the difference hardly mattered. Hannah noticed his approach from the corner of her eye and finished labeling a syringe before setting it carefully into the tray beside her. She turned to greet him politely, ready to provide whatever update he needed for the next patient. Dr. Keller stopped at the counter and reviewed the chart she had prepared, his brow tightening slightly as he considered the notes in front of him. For several seconds, the only sound between them was the soft tapping of his finger against the tablet screen. Then he asked a series of quick questions regarding the patient's medication timing and intake records. Hannah answered each one clearly and respectfully, explaining the steps she had already taken and confirming the orders listed in the chart. Her voice remained calm, and her hands stayed folded neatly in front of her while she spoke. The exchange lasted less than a minute before Dr. Keller turned away to continue toward the trauma bay. From the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca leaned back in his chair again, studying the interaction through the glass partition. What he saw was not simply a routine conversation between a doctor and a nurse. It was a quiet demonstration of composure under pressure. The surgeon carried authority that shaped the entire room. Yet the young nurse standing behind the counter carried something different, something less visible, but equally strong. And as the emergency room resumed its steady pace once more, Vincent realized that the night at St. Matthew's Medical Center had become far more interesting than he had expected when he first walked through the hospital doors. The emergency room continued its quiet storm of motion as the hours crept deeper into the night, the bright fluorescent lights casting pale reflections across stainless steel counters and polished tile floors. Hannah Brooks stood beside the medication station reviewing another patient chart, her eyes moving carefully over each line before confirming the dosage on a small bottle of antibiotics. She had learned long ago that in a place where every second mattered, accuracy was a form of respect for the people trusting the hospital with their health. A few feet away, a worried mother paced slowly beside her teenage son, who sat holding his ankle after a basketball injury. Hannah finished labeling the medication tray and approached them with a calm smile, explaining that the doctor would need to examine the swelling before deciding whether imaging was necessary. Her tone was patient and steady, the kind of voice that quietly lowered the tension in the room. The boy listened while trying to act brave, and his mother nodded with visible relief that someone had taken the time to explain what would happen next. Moments like that passed unnoticed by most of the busy staff moving through the department, but Vincent DeLuca noticed every one of them. From his seat beyond the glass partition, he had been studying the rhythm of the emergency room for nearly an hour now. The department was filled with skilled professionals working under pressure, yet one detail remained constant in his observations. Whenever anxiety appeared in a patient's face, Hannah Brooks was the person who stepped forward to steady the moment. She never raised her voice, never rushed past someone who looked frightened, and never allowed irritation to appear even when the room grew louder and more demanding. Vincent had spent much of his life around powerful personalities, men who believed authority alone created respect. Yet what he was watching inside St. Matthew's was something entirely different. Respect, in this case, came from patience. It came from the ability to stay calm while everyone else moved faster. As Hannah returned to the counter and organized another tray of supplies, Dr. Andrew Keller walked back into the center of the department, scanning the charts displayed on his tablet with focused intensity. His presence again changed the energy of the room in subtle ways. Conversations shortened. Younger staff members stepped slightly aside as he passed. The surgeon's reputation had built an invisible boundary around him that few people crossed. Hannah noticed him approaching and immediately prepared the next set of patient notes so he would have the information ready when he arrived. When Dr. Keller reached the counter, he reviewed the chart quickly, asking for confirmation on the patient's medication schedule and intake notes. Hannah answered each question clearly and respectfully, pointing to the updated entries she had already prepared. The exchange was brief and professional, lasting only long enough for Dr. Keller to confirm the next step in the patient's treatment before moving toward the trauma bay again. Across the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze following Hannah as she resumed her work without hesitation. To anyone else it might have looked like an ordinary shift inside an ordinary hospital, yet the quiet strength of the young nurse continued to hold his attention. She had been corrected in front of the entire room earlier, yet she showed no resentment, no impatience, and no sign that the moment had shaken her resolve. Instead, she continued offering the same calm reassurance to every patient who crossed her path. And in a place where authority spoke loudly and stress never truly disappeared, Hannah Brooks carried something far more powerful than rank or reputation. She carried the quiet dignity of someone who chose kindness even when no one required it. The steady rhythm of the emergency room continued as midnight quietly slipped toward the early hours of the morning, the kind of hour when fatigue settled into the shoulders of even the most experienced staff. Yet the work never slowed. Monitors continued their soft electronic chirping, stretchers rolled through the wide doors every few minutes, and the overhead lights remained bright enough to erase any sense of night outside the hospital walls. Hannah Brooks stood beside the medication counter once again, reviewing a new intake chart that had just been placed in the system. A middle-aged construction worker sat nearby holding his wrist after a workplace fall, his boots still dusty from the job site. Hannah approached him with the same calm patience she had shown every other patient that night, explaining that the physician would examine the injury and possibly request imaging to check for a fracture. Her voice carried a quiet reassurance that softened the man's tense expression almost immediately. When she finished, she carefully adjusted the support pillow beneath his arm so that he could rest comfortably while waiting. The small gesture took only a few seconds, but it left the patient visibly calmer. From the waiting area, Vincent DeLuca watched the exchange with growing focus. The longer he observed the department, the more clearly the contrast between authority and character revealed itself. Dr. Andrew Keller commanded the emergency room with reputation and confidence, moving through the staff like a man who had long ago grown used to unquestioned control. Yet the quiet nurse working beside the medication counter demonstrated a different form of strength. Hannah Brooks did not dominate the room, but she steadied it. Whenever tension rose, her calm voice lowered it again. Vincent had spent enough years reading human behavior to recognize genuine character when he saw it, and something about Hannah's steady composure continued to hold his attention. At that moment, another call came through the sliding doors as a paramedic team rolled in a patient complaining of severe dizziness. Staff immediately moved to assist, clearing space in the examination bay while Dr. Keller stepped forward to assess the situation. Hannah prepared the necessary equipment quickly, arranging the instruments on the tray before bringing them to the bedside, where the physician stood reviewing the patient's symptoms. For several seconds, the interaction remained purely clinical as the surgeon asked questions and the patient described the sudden wave of vertigo that had brought him to the hospital. Hannah positioned the monitoring cable carefully and confirmed the patient's identification bracelet, her movements efficient but respectful. Then, as she reached for a small instrument from the tray beside the bed, the wheel of a nearby supply cart rolled across the floor and lightly bumped the edge of the table. The tray shifted slightly, and one small tool slid a few inches across the metal surface with a faint sound. It was a minor movement that would have passed unnoticed in most busy rooms. But Dr. Keller noticed it immediately. The surgeon turned sharply, his expression tightening as his eyes moved from the tray to Hannah. The nearby resident paused mid-sentence. A nurse at the chart station lowered her gaze toward the computer screen. The subtle tension that followed was familiar to everyone who worked the overnight shift. Hannah straightened quietly, steadying the tray and adjusting the instruments back into place before speaking. Her voice remained calm as she acknowledged the movement and confirmed that all equipment remained sterile and ready for use. Yet the surgeon's attention remained fixed on her, and the surrounding staff felt the shift in the room even before another word was spoken. Across the glass partition, Vincent DeLuca slowly rose from his chair in the waiting area, his eyes focused on the scene unfolding inside the emergency room as the quiet moment began to stretch into something far more serious. The air inside the emergency room seemed to pause for a moment after the tray shifted, as if every person nearby sensed the tension before a single word was spoken. Dr. Andrew Keller looked from the instrument tray to Hannah Brooks with a sharp expression that had made many younger staff members uncomfortable during past shifts. The room did not stop working, but the energy changed in subtle ways. A resident slowly lowered his clipboard. Another nurse turned slightly toward a monitor that did not actually need adjustment. Everyone continued moving, yet no one truly ignored the moment. Hannah kept her posture steady, both hands resting lightly against the edge of the tray while she confirmed once again that every instrument remained in the correct place. Her voice was calm as she explained that the cart had brushed the table and that the sterile field remained intact. She spoke clearly, respectfully, and without defensiveness. For a few seconds the surgeon said nothing. His eyes studied the tray, then the surrounding area, as if measuring whether the explanation satisfied him. The patient lying on the examination bed shifted slightly, watching the exchange with uncertain curiosity. The overhead monitor continued its gentle electronic rhythm, the soft beeping the only sound that filled the silence between them. Then Dr. Keller spoke again, his voice firm but controlled, reminding the staff that attention to detail inside the emergency room was never optional. The words were directed toward Hannah, but they were loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Several nurses at the station lowered their eyes toward their screens, familiar with the pattern of public correction that sometimes followed even small disruptions. Hannah nodded respectfully and thanked the doctor for the reminder, adjusting the tray one final time before stepping slightly aside so the patient could be examined without obstruction. Her composure did not crack, and she did not raise her voice. Instead, she focused on the patient's comfort, quietly adjusting the pillow behind his head and asking if the room temperature felt comfortable enough. The patient answered with a small nod, clearly more relaxed after the brief tension passed. From the waiting area beyond the glass partition, Vincent DeLuca had already risen from his chair. He stood still for a moment, his gaze steady as he observed the entire scene unfolding inside the department. The movement had caught the attention of a hospital security officer standing near the reception desk, who briefly glanced toward him before returning to his post. To anyone else, Vincent appeared to be simply another visitor preparing to approach the staff for an update. Yet his focus remained fixed on the center of the emergency room, where Hannah Brooks continued assisting the patient as though nothing unusual had occurred. The contrast between the surgeon's authority and the nurse's quiet composure was unmistakable. Dr. Keller turned his attention back to the patient's chart, asking a few clinical questions about the dizziness that had brought the man to the hospital. Hannah responded with the relevant intake information and passed the doctor the next instrument he requested, her movements careful and efficient. Within seconds the examination resumed, the department returning once again to its constant flow of activity. Yet the earlier tension lingered faintly in the air like an echo no one openly acknowledged. Vincent took a slow step forward from the waiting area, his eyes still on Hannah Brooks as she continued her duties without complaint. And as the distance between the waiting room and the center of the emergency department quietly closed, the room had not yet realized that the silent observer who had been watching all night was finally moving toward the place where the next moment would unfold. The quiet tension that lingered in the emergency room did not fully disappear even as the examination continued. Dr. Andrew Keller finished reviewing the patient's symptoms and gave a brief instruction to the resident beside him, his voice returning to the calm authority that had guided the department for years. The patient nodded while Hannah Brooks adjusted the monitoring cable once more and made a note on the chart resting against the edge of the bed. Around them, the emergency room resumed its usual movement. A nurse wheeled a portable machine toward another bay. A paramedic spoke quietly with the intake desk about an arriving patient. Yet several members of the staff still carried the faint awareness that something had shifted in the room. At that moment, Vincent DeLuca stepped fully beyond the glass partition and into the emergency department. His pace was calm, his posture relaxed, yet the quiet confidence in his movement drew subtle attention from the people closest to the entrance. One of the reception nurses glanced up first, then a security officer standing near the desk straightened slightly, as if recognizing something familiar about the man approaching. Vincent did not hurry. He simply walked across the polished floor until he stood a few feet from the examination bay, where Dr. Keller and Hannah were finishing their tasks. The surgeon noticed him only after completing the final instruction to the resident. Dr. Keller looked up, clearly expecting a visitor asking about a patient. "Sir, if you are waiting for an update, the reception desk will assist you," he said in a measured professional tone without fully turning his body away from the bed. Vincent stopped beside the counter, his gaze briefly shifting from the surgeon to Hannah Brooks before returning again. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily through the nearby space. He said that he had been sitting in the waiting area for some time and had observed the work being done inside the department. The statement itself sounded simple, yet the calm authority behind it made several staff members glance toward him again. Dr. Keller studied the unfamiliar visitor more closely now, clearly trying to determine why the man had approached the treatment area without announcement. Vincent continued speaking in the same steady tone, explaining that hospitals required both skill and patience to function well, and that respect between professionals was as important as medical expertise. The words were not loud, and they were not spoken with anger. They simply carried a weight that made the surrounding room grow quiet for a moment. Hannah stood still beside the tray, unsure whether the comment was directed toward anyone in particular. The patient on the bed watched curiously while the resident paused mid-note. A security officer near the reception desk had begun walking slowly closer, his expression changing as recognition dawned across his face. He stopped several steps away and spoke carefully, addressing the visitor by name with respectful caution. The single name was enough to ripple through the nearby staff like a whisper traveling across water. Vincent DeLuca nodded slightly in acknowledgement without looking away from the surgeon. Dr. Keller's posture shifted almost imperceptibly as he realized the identity of the man standing before him. The emergency room remained bright, busy, and filled with motion, yet for one brief moment the entire space seemed to hold its breath. Vincent's gaze then moved once more toward Hannah Brooks, who still stood beside the tray with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the night. And in that calm moment, surrounded by the steady hum of machines and the watchful silence of the staff, it became clear to everyone present that dignity in the emergency room had finally been noticed by someone powerful enough to ensure it would not be ignored again.